Hello, everyone. I'm Henry McKembe, and welcome to Do Big Talks, where we discuss the latest trends and news in the ever evolving digital world. On today's episode, we'll be talking about the importance of women representation in our government and the strategies for women led campaigns with Executive Director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, Amanda Hunter. I've had the pleasure of working with Amanda and the foundation for quite a number of years, so I'm very, very excited to be talking to her today. Welcome, Amanda. Why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and about what the foundation does?
Thank you so much for having me on. The Barbara Lee Family Foundation advances women's equality and representation in American politics and also in the field of contemporary art. And our work is really guided by the core belief that women's voices strengthen our democracy and enrich our culture. We achieve our overall mission through our political research program, strategic partnerships, grant making, and endowments. I'm the executive director of the foundation, so I lead our nonpartisan efforts to advance women's political equality and increase representation. Previously, I served as BLFF's research and communications director.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Amanda. Like I said, I've had the chance to work with you all for the last couple of years, and every year and every election cycle, I'm always at awe by the work that you all put out. So, for anybody who doesn't know about the foundation, do Google them and do Google their work, dating back, I think, to 2018 presidential election cycle. So it's been awesome. And speaking of work, you all have just released a report about women in the workplace in the pandemic politics that revealed a number of interesting kind of data points about where things are when it comes to women in politics. Can you talk a little bit about the goal of the report and some of the interesting key findings of that report?
Absolutely. And actually, Henry, 2018 was our 20th anniversary. So Barbara has actually been doing this research and this work since 1998, if you can believe it. So a
Wow,
lot has changed,
a little bit.
thankfully, for women in politics since 1998, but a lot, unfortunately, has not changed too. And as Barbara likes to say, women have really been at the forefront of our country's social and political progress, from the suffrage movement to civil rights. And women will continue to shape our trajectory as we rebuild after 2 years of the pandemic and all of the other crises that our country has faced. Our goal with this new research was really to understand what is top of mind for women voters and how they're faring in the wake of these difficult years. So, along with our partners at American University in Washington, D.C., through our Gender on the Ballot program, Benenson Research did a poll for us surveying women voters on a wide range of topics, from work to politics and caregiving. And we found that women are really shaping our new normal in this country. We had conducted a poll on similar topics at this time last year, so we were able to track some of the changes in women's opinion, which was really helpful. And generally, what we found is that there's a consensus that life will never go back to normal, as I'm sure many of your listeners have seen. Last year, about a quarter of women said they don't believe life will ever go back to normal. And this year, that number rose to 40%, really illustrating how much life has changed for women. And we also found that, again, no surprise, the economy and inflation are big sources of stress for women. Women are feeling the impacts of the pandemic in their pockets, and 59% of the women we surveyed indicated pessimism about the economy, and half the women said that their personal financial situations have really gotten worse since the pandemic began. And finally, women voters see women in political office as a positive influence, and they support electing more women. 3 in 4 Democratic women and over half of independents want to see more women in office. So despite the fact most of this poll is very disappointing when you think about women's lives, the bright spot that we found is that women recognize having more women in office improves the lives of women.
Um, that's a great kind of point to end on there. Just digging in a little bit on that, when you think having more women in office will be better for women life, what do you think some candidates, women or men candidates, can take into this election cycle? What kind of messaging could they take into this cycle to really lean in on those points?
That's a really great question, Henry, because what we see in this poll is really a cry for a sort of a red alert in a lot of ways, that women are pointing out cracks in the system that have really been amplified over the last couple of years. And it's important for any leader to realize that women are exhausted, they're burnt out. We saw that even though women think that the November election is going to be one of the most consequential of their life, there are a number of women who have dropped out of following politics and have disengaged because it's just simply too stressful. And we saw that particularly with younger women and women of color. And that's no surprise, because this pandemic has really disproportionately impacted women in those two groups. So for anyone that is a leader or that is running for office, it's important to realize that there are a lot of programs and structural issues that have really failed women during the pandemic. And it's important to address the economic disparities, the fact that women are falling behind at work, that childcare is such a major issue, and access to healthcare. There are a lot of women who have had to step down from their jobs to either care for children or care for other relatives. And that's something that not a lot of people are talking about.
Yeah, I think totally can agree more with the childcare. Being a parent myself, we were fortunate enough to make it work during the pandemic, but definitely a lot of friends of mine were affected, and definitely, as you said, disproportionately fell onto women in those households to do caregiving, and a number of clients that we work with, including CIU 2015 out in California, are dealing with that issue of childcare and care in general. So thank you for talking about that a little bit. One thing I want to dig into is, how do you think digital and social media can play into reaching these women that are disaffected about politics? And what do you think are some of the things that candidate can do to really reach those populations? Because as we know, women, especially women of color, were kind of the differentiating maker in the last cycle.
Absolutely. And what we know right now, and what you've probably seen even with folks that you know, are that a lot of women don't have time to be engaging in typical media. Even if women have the TV on and they're watching the news, a lot of times it might be muted because they're doing 12 other things and trying to talk to their kids and their families. So it's really about finding women where they are in the few moments of free time that women may have. Maybe it's a podcast while they're commuting. Maybe it's social media late at night after their kids have gone to bed. But it's also about creating content that is going to be compelling and uplifting. We found in our other research that voters respond to positive messages a lot better than negative messages. And especially at a time where so many women are reporting to feel burned out, it seems like positive messaging, talking about what you're for rather than what you're against, is going to be more exciting to women, frankly.
Thank you. And speaking of women, have you found that digital has helped more women run for office? And if so, what is kind of that effect that you've seen for women candidate in general?
Well, we've definitely seen an explosion in women's political representation over the last 5 years. And that's really been attributed to a number of factors. Where social media has made a big difference, at least in the mind of my boss, who, like I said, has been doing this work for decades, is that when she started doing this work in the late 90s, she thought that having women mayors and women governors was the best pipeline to having a woman president, which is her ultimate dream. And since the advent of social media, we've really seen women in the Senate, women in Congress, and women at other levels of government get national attention for their leadership, especially when videos have gone viral on social media. You think about women like Katie Porter with her whiteboard, or now Vice President Kamala Harris sitting on the Judiciary Committee, tongue-tying some of the men in the Trump administration during her hearings. All of these social media clips have helped raise women's profile. And then you look at some of the more recent superstars in Congress like AOC, who has really been able to effectively use social media to build her power and to speak directly to her supporters.
Yeah, I think what I take away from the clips that you've mentioned is the authenticity itself. Like, right, I feel like you couldn't duplicate Katie and her whiteboard because I've watched those videos tons, as well as AOC. Sometimes from the places where she takes those videos, really, it's about the authentic selves. And as you're talking about Madam Vice President, when she was a digital committee, like it's her as a lawyer as her best going after folks, right? And so I think the authenticity of those videos can just not be duplicated. When you're coming out about a polished product and video. So I think in that regard, social media has given us great insight into what these great women can do. So I totally agree with that. One last question: what is kind of your prognostics for the 2022 cycle? What do you think? How do you think women candidates are going to do, and what do you think folks can do to get women more interested in politics? As your polling shows that some of them have stopped paying attention.
Well, I think also just going back to social media for a minute, I would be remiss if I didn't point out some of the drawbacks of social media, unfortunately, for women in
Please do.
politics. Yeah, we've seen women disproportionately face harassment on social media and to face threats of violence. There have been some studies recently that show that women, and particularly women of color in elected office, report facing far worse threats of violence and harassment on social media, not to mention all the disinformation that can be out there around women thinking about Hillary Clinton and Vice President Harris and others. So, although there are so many positives with social media for women in politics, just like everything else with social media, there's always a negative to outweigh the positive. And I think that more attention needs to be paid around those safety and security issues for women, because that's a structural barrier, especially when you look at women getting involved in local politics that aren't going to have a security detail and need to think about how this is going to affect their family and their children.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point there. And then we've seen all those board of elections debates that have gone viral, where in fact a lot of women who are in those offices get threatened. And I know Shireen Mitchell does a lot of study and tracking of that online as well. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I think to be positive, to end on a positive note, there are lots of opportunities for women in 2022. What's exciting for us is the fact that women are showing up as their authentic selves. When my boss, Barbara Lee, started this work in the late 90s, women were really trying to fit into a template that was built for men. And they might not have been bringing the whole of their lived experience on the campaign trail. And now, since really 2017, especially, we've seen women show up unapologetically as themselves, sharing very personal stories in their biography and talking about how that's going to influence the decisions that they will make as leaders. And especially after having 2 years that have completely transformed the way we think about so much in this country, but especially around things that tend to affect women more, like childcare, like healthcare, like pay equity. It's going to be more important to see women leaders at the table and talking about their own lives and how that's going to inform their decisions moving forward.
Couldn't agree more. And I think we'll all be the better for it the more women are represented in positions of leadership, both at the national and the local level. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the rest of you for joining us for another installment of Two Big Talks. If you have any topic that you'd like us to discuss, feel free to reach out and stay tuned for future episodes. Thank you, everybody.